Before reconciliation, we have to start with the truth. How many schools do you know have a graveyard where the students were asked to bury their classmates?
The truth is, Indigenous people on Turtle Island are living in the remnants of an apocalypse right now. This is our dystopia. This is not what we imagined our future to be like, and here we are having to fight for our rights.
When it comes to reconciliation, I use a symbol that we call the medicine wheel, and it's just a learning tool that represents many different things, but it's divided into 4 equal quadrants. And one of the teachings is that the 4 sections represent the 4 life stages.
So hello and welcome. Thank you very much, Sonia, for joining us today. And it's a pleasure, and thank you very much for joining despite the short notice and everything.
Well, thank you for reaching out.
Thank you. So in the beginning, I would love to celebrate and appreciate the Reconciliation Day. And, like this week is full of special occasions. We have the Reconciliation Day, we have the Teachers' Day. So I would love to ask you what comes to your mind first, thinking of these things, like now we need to learn, and through knowledge, we know about rights and what we should do. So what would you like to say in the beginning?
Before reconciliation, we have to start with the truth. How many schools do you know have a graveyard where the students were asked to bury their classmates? Before we can do reconciliation, we have to remember some of those children are still living among us as grandparents and great-grandparents. This is not centuries ago. The last school closed in 1996. So, and we have the privilege of calling it a school, right? Many of the survivors are now calling it an internment camp, an extermination camp, a death camp, rather than a residential school. Because your school has a playground, has a schoolyard where children have recess. Theirs have a graveyard. The Indian hospital sites have unmarked graves. And parents were not informed. Families were not allowed to have the body back. The remains of their dead child were hidden from them for centuries. From the first, and we have to go back to the missionary schools of Eastern Canada, which are very different to the residential schools set up from 18 whatever to 1996, because the first Europeans brought their missionaries, and their missionaries started imposing the Catholic religion and the French and English languages as a replacement to the Indigenous languages and the Indigenous faith systems that were very well established from, Tierra del Fuego down south of Argentina, all the way to the Arctic peoples of the Americas. And the northern portion of that is called Turtle Island. Today, most of them speak English because that's the primary language that was imposed. And when we think, oh, it happened such a long time ago, my grandmother was beaten until she only spoke French. And she died in 1986. So don't tell me it was a long time ago. I was finishing community college at the time that she died. And she never talked about these
memory.
Yeah, it's not that long ago. So telling us Indigenous people status, non-status, right? Women lost their status because they married a non-native man. Well, nobody looks at why did they marry a non-native man? We look at the coureur de bois who took a white wife in the fort and in the city, but took a native wife as a guide on the territory so he could take the fur, take the product of their livelihood back to the city. We look at the Fort Hudson's Bay Company is a beautiful industry. It's a Canada symbol, right? But the Indigenous women who were married to white men were not allowed inside the forts. We look at Indigenous warriors and we say, hey, they were brave, they scalped. No, they learned that from the invader force. Because the Indigenous warrior, the biggest battle is the demons within, learning self-control and self-discipline. And a warrior is not a gendered role. It's not a soldier. A warrior looks after the whole community. Family, not family, doesn't matter. Whereas a soldier obeys the hierarchy, the chain of command. So you can't call a soldier a warrior. Then you look at the native soldiers who came home from World War I, World War II, Korea, you name it, and they couldn't participate in Legion activities. They couldn't get their benefits because the Veterans Affairs were in the Legions, and the Legion offices were selling alcohol, and Indigenous people were forbidden alcohol after the Europeans gave them alcohol to take their land from them. Those are the truths that we have to look at before we can start talking about reconciliation. Because reconciliation means we all know what happened. We can begin to have empathy and compassion for the homelessness, right? Mother Nature is cruel, but she's not vindictive. Humanity has a vindictive streak that keeps, if you don't speak university English, you can't study what you're interested in. If you can't speak English, you can't go to school to learn about the stars, about science and medicine and mathematics and engineering, because you don't have the dominant language. So Indigenous people were given an education just enough to be servants, manual labor, never to have CEO skills, executive vocabulary and ideas. And yeah, some of them did learn, some of the students, the survivors did learn something, but are they running companies? Are they profitable? Or are they stuck with the memories of having had to hear other students cry every night? Fear the sexual abuse, the physical violence every day and every night. When you live with that fear, PTSD is not just for the battlefield. And the battlefield is not just between adults with guns. And that's the truth that reconciliation, that September 30, is asking people to be aware of. When we think of World War II and we think of the Holocaust, they have museums. They are outspoken. Everybody, you can go with your camera, walk through the death camps. And yet the Canadian government has given permission to destroy the documents that prove these children were destroyed by people who should have taught them to love learning, taught them to love themselves. The Orange Shirt Day. Mom made a beautiful shirt for this child, sent the child to school. The child went with honor and dignity and confidence, and the school took that shirt away like it was a piece of garbage and cut the hair off like it was nothing. We still have people today cutting Indigenous and Black children's hair at school because their hair is too weird.
Yeah, heard of that, seen.
We still have little boys who have hair down to their butts with a beautiful braid being called sissy or other horrible names because other people, non-native people mostly, don't know the cultural wealth of that braid, the connection that that child has because of that long braid. And it's like, seriously? we can't imagine, we can't ask innocent questions like, can you talk to me about your braid?
Exactly.
That's truth and reconciliation.
Mm.
Can you tell me who braided your hair and why that person? That's cultural sensitivity, not appropriation, and not erasing the significance. It's not just a hairdo. It's not just to
Right.
keep the hair out of the face. You know, there's a reason for, and it's all spiritual, and it's all like meaningful, philosophically meaningful stuff. The color you wear, the medicine wheel has colors for a reason, right? The trees in the boreal forest change color for a reason. And the trees, when they let go their leaves, right? The beauty of releasing is a reflection of the grief we feel when we lose something or someone we love. But we continue to live, we continue to grow. And when you look at Indigenous people who lived with the forest, the trees don't sit there, you know, depressed.
Mm-hmm.
They grow buds the next year. They come green again. There is life after. But there is a time of silence and quiet and introspection and examining the values, right? Where does my food come from? And who provides that for me? Well, it's the earth. So Mother Earth, we can't just continue taking the forest. And right now, Fairy Creek in BC is fighting both the industry and the RCMP in court to protect old growth forest. The Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, they have the legal and treaty right of fisheries, and non-native people are destroying their fisheries, their ships, their traps, their docking, everything. No problem. No court case. No school authority has been brought to court for abusing generations of Indigenous children, for not informing the parents when the child died, for lying to the child about the value of their language and culture. And we want reconciliation without justice? That's not how this works. If you have a shop and somebody breaks into your shop and steals from you, do you not want the court case to recognize your right to that shop and product before telling you to, you know, get over it? You can file an insurance claim and replace the goods, but can you replace that connection to your family line?
No.
Right? And in Australia, this is the interesting part. They have the dream space. The daytime is based on the dream space. So when they have their song line passed down from generation to generation, in New Zealand, same thing, right? Keeping the song line alive. It's not about blood. And that's where the status Indigenous, the Indian Act is apartheid in Canada, because the government decides if you have status, not the people themselves.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you also about this part, but before that, I wanted to. So first off, how would we call September 30? Like reconciliation still, or
Truth
Truth Day?
and truth and reconciliation. Truth is first. And that's why the report, the TRC report, if you can look at the truth and you can admit and work with making that truth, yeah, I accept this. This is fact. I'm not going to deny it. I'm not going to take it over either. It's not my pain. It's the pain of the survivors. I'm going to sit next to them and I'm going to listen to them. I'm going to hear their stories from them, not from a history book. Right? And if it means that we have to video record our survivors before they die, and if they're willing, then fine. But we have to stop looking at the history books as written by the conqueror.
Yeah.
And
Always
that's the final word.
History is always written by the conqueror, the winner.
Well, not necessarily the winner, because the Indigenous people are not dead. We're not gone yet.
Definitely, yeah.
They lost. You know, we have survivors for a reason. The genocide did not work. It was an attempt, and it was a damn good one. But not everybody died, and not everybody forgot. So now we have our first generation of young people who are going into med school, going into engineering, going into sciences, mathematics, fields of research. But we're still making them do it in the European way. And we're trying to tell the European way of doing things, your way is not the only way. So when we look at Indigenous education, we have to remove the word school from education. Because when you wake up in the morning and you've got grandma and auntie discussing the harvest of today, they're going to go berry picking, they're going to go, plant picking, or they're going to go set up something for some living plant or some living animal. Well, that's learning. Right. And you're learning the life habit, the life cycle of that plant. You're learning the nutrients required by that plant. So you're learning to care for yourself, because that plant is going to give you something. But you're also learning to make sure that that plant survives so that the two of you can benefit mutually. So right from the very beginning of infancy, before you leave your mother's lap, you're learning about life cycle, life habits, life needs. And not just your human life, but that mutual respect, that mutual relationship. Many Indigenous languages of the Americas have that concept of relationship between human being, human living being, and other living being.
Right.
So
even the word school, or the way education used to be structured, was like more that we are trying to get our children back to be able to touch life, not to sit in a classroom closed from everywhere, you cannot see what is outside. They used to look at the sky, they used to touch the ground, right? So could you tell me more about what we know now about the educational structure in the past?
Well, if right now we have examples in New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and Finland, where they're JK to grade 4 about, the kids are outside more. They learn intuitively. They learn by their interests. It's almost like a Montessori system without the Montessori structure and without the 4 walls. In the Maori people in New Zealand, the children are taught the physical action, the dance, the language, the grammar, and the story all together, not separately. So you don't go to dance class and then sewing class and then singing class. It's all holistically together, right? Everybody eats. It doesn't matter what you eat, vegan or vegetarian or whatever. So where does food come from? So the food cycle. The Japanese kids have got that down pat, because the children are required to partake in the cafeteria food prep, food sharing, and then after meal cleanup before they have their first test at school. So they're much more holistically connected to, if I'm hungry, I'm not going to learn. But in order to eat, I have to learn to care for the food, to care for where I consume that food and what happens to the food that didn't get consumed. What does it do? Where does it go? So let's not waste, because those kids are exposed to what does a garbage can look like and where does it go from here? They don't have unlimited land space. So they've had to learn composting at like microscopic levels.
Right.
Finland, Mother Nature will kill you if you don't know how to live in winter.
That's right.
The end. This is not a maybe. You have to learn about layers. And when you learn about the layers of clothing, well, there's self-care, there's physical health, mental health, there's mutual health. Because if I don't take care of the trees, then the trees can't protect me in the wind and snow and rain. So there's a lot of that spontaneous learning that's happening when the kids realize they don't want me to climb the trees or kick the trees or destroy the trees, because those trees are actually keeping me alive for much of the dying time. I was like, son of a gun, you mean there's a reason for that? We have disconnected our kids so much from the dirt, the bacteria, the fungus, the spores, the mushrooms, the little living things that make sure the trees can communicate with each other. We've forgotten that trees are sentient beings. It's not a question, it's a known, established fact. If you go to a tree, pick any in your neighborhood, and you go to the same tree every day, and you talk to that tree, there is a resonance that goes between you and that tree that Indigenous people have always known this. And your mental health is not at risk because the tree provides you with the oxygen you need. You provide the tree with the carbon monoxide, dioxide that it needs. There's mutual benefit. So when we have Native people living in gray spaces, cement, asphalt, four walls, no windows, no plant life in the building, no garden, no yard. And we wonder why they're not well. Why can't they accept this? Well, we've taken their feet off the dirt, off Mother Earth, that we've disconnected them, and it's not their fault. And the only buildings that these people have known, right? When they were in the building, they were abused. So every time you approach that building, you start shaking inside and you have that fear of, is it going to happen again? I didn't know what to do the first time or the next time or the last time. What am I going to do this time? There's no trauma healing. And we're trying to look at addiction as an isolated problem instead of as a symptom, an outcome of that childhood abuse. We didn't teach coping mechanisms and healing paths that are not based on take this pill, talk to me for an hour, time's up, see you next week. No, it doesn't work like that. If you can, a sharing circle is a very sacred space. It's a very safe space, but it's not for conversation. You're not talking to each other. You're talking in the presence of people who are there for you. There's no crosstalk. There's no cutting off. There's no interruption. And when you go to a psychologist or a counselor or whatever, right? They give you the box of tissues, right? Mm-hmm. Well, for Indigenous people, that means, here, take this tissue, stop crying. Instead of allowing the tears and the toxins to leave the body until the person has done their crying. Then they go have a wash and have a nap and pick up feeling refreshed because it did all come out. When you stop a hurt person from crying it out to meet their own needs, you're telling them that crying is wrong. And that's an education in mental health that we still haven't realized in Western medicine, but that was very well known. Even in Italy, they have mourners in Renaissance times, right?
That's right.
They would hire mourners to come and scream it out and cry it out loud and have the world hear them. Well, but there was a reason for that. It gave permission for the family to grieve privately while the attention was drawn to the public mourners.
Wow.
You know, that has to come back. That's Indigenous as well.
Mm.
And it predates the concept of conquering. It predates the concept of ownership. Like, do you know how many native languages, Indigenous languages, don't have the word for ownership? I thought of it, I created it, I built it, I made it, I used it, and now it's available to anybody who needs it. It's not mine because I made it.
Oh my God. Wow.
So when we teach school, when we teach education, you know something I need to learn, I want to learn. So I'm going to go sit next to you and I'm going to watch you do whatever it is you do. And I'm going to learn from you. No matter how old or how young you are, no matter what your certificates or qualifications are, because some spark inside of me recognized some spark inside of you.
Yeah.
And that's the teacher-learner relationship that is very natural. It's not because you went to teachers college and have a B.Ed in mathematics that you become a teacher. You have learned a teachable. We have separated mathematics from cooking, but can you cook a recipe without mathematics?
The measurements, the
We
yeah.
have separated sewing, making clothing, shelter from mathematics. So why are we learning these silly little numbers on a piece of paper without the material to make a jacket, a hat, a scarf, pair of socks, a pair of boots? We have told children that we have to have rubber boots. We have to have winter boots. Well, how do we make them? Oh, it's a factory. So the kid, where does milk come from? The grocery store. We've disconnected them from the cow or the goat or the camel. And then we wonder why the test is meaningless.
Absolutely.
So when we're talking about Indigenous education, we have to get away from that. Oh, it has to be spiritual. It has to be like a powwow. It has to be arts and crafts. It has to be, it's really, really pretty and I really, really like it. Well, yeah, but everything they make is also practical. It's not something you hang on the wall and leave there. It's symbolically representative of a story, of a storyline, of a family tree, as we would call it today, but also as a connection, because adoption in the Native mindset is, well, yeah, if we have a death in our community, but we know somebody else is fitting the bill, that person can become a member of our community because of the knowledge that they hold and the mindset that they hold. And again, going back to my grandmother, she didn't speak a lot, but she'd say things like, either you are or you aren't. There is no halfway. And in modern speaking, that becomes, you're either Indigenous mind-like or conqueror mind-like.
Wow.
There is no half-breed,
Mm.
because it's not about breeding. It's about mindset. And no matter where you come from, where you were born, right? If your mindset is parallel to an Indigenous community, you can be adopted into one of the communities and be recognized as a member, even though your bloodline is obviously Egypt.
Wow.
Because it's
And
not
that
about
was in the past as well?
Yeah. How do you do trade if you don't speak the languages of your neighbors? Why would you replace your language with the language of your neighbors? Because you still have to speak to your people. So multilingualism was also a normal concept to do trade. Sign language was Indigenous thousands of years before the Europeans showed up. And that's why limiting the Indigenous people to ASL is really frustrating for them. They have their own sign language, but it's not being recognized. They have their own way of writing their language that our keyboards don't allow. So you want to send a text, you have to use English or French. You can't use their language. Cree symbolics, right? If you look at the Cree language and the Inuit have been there for thousands of years. Ice Age? What Ice Age? You know, they've lived on ice.
Was there like a process for recreating symbols or alphabet for any
If,
of the languages of the
if
indigenous
the,
languages?
well, it depends on the nation, right? Because if they have young speakers who want to use the technology, have the imagination of understanding how to code, so that using technology is an extension of their own language rather than a replacement of their own language, then yes, these are possible. But we have to convince Google and Apple and other big companies to give room, give up your copyright ownership, allow the smaller groups some niche space to use already existing open code, but to adapt it to their own symbolics, to their own graphic writings systems, their own sign language, right? Voice recognition software. Is that Urdu? No, it's Innu. What's Innu? It's like, it's a freaking language. They recognize Middle Eastern languages before they recognize North American indigenous languages, even though the company is in the US. That's the frustration of school education and corporate greed that Indigenous people have struggled with, because that's not their way. That's not the way to, you can't thrive at the expense of anybody else. You can only thrive when everybody, every living being is also thriving. And it's hard to understand, like, yeah, they did use wood for fire and for shelter. They didn't take all of the trees. They used birch bark to make canoes. They still do. They don't kill the tree. We don't have trees where it takes 4 people around to get around the trunk anymore from coast to coast to coast, because the Europeans have come in with their lumber industry. And just because you've replanted one breed of tree to have it straight and tall so you can have telegraph poles, that's not a forest. You need birch and beech and poplar and oak and maple and spruce and all living together to make a forest. If you have all one kind of tree, and many lumber industries have done that, and they say it's sustainable development. No, it's not, because you don't have birds. You don't have birds, you don't have seeds, you don't have seeds, you don't have flowers, you don't have flowers, you don't have bees. You don't have bees, you don't have food. The end, you know, bees are pollinators of everything. And your grocery store is going to be empty if we don't have bees. So between your rows of perfect trees, put flowers. Around the edges of your fields, put flowers, bushes, hedges, living hedges, not fences and fence posts. You know, allow space on your property for other living beings to walk across. Now, I don't know about Toronto so much, but up here, it's not unusual, up in Sudbury, it's not unusual to have bear walking down the street, moose in the park, in the lakes, in the creeks. It's not unusual to have fox, duck, you know, goose all over the place. And that's the wealth of this city. Yes, it's huge by land, but for the most part, those who grew up here, right? We know that we have blueberry patches. We never take all of them. We have mushroom patches. We never take all of them. We have edible flowers and edible herbs. Never take all of them. You know, when you go out in the field and there's a farmer and he planted carrots and corn and whatever for the market, he harvests everything, leaving nothing even for the worms in the dirt.
Mm.
That's why manure and pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer have to be used. Well, we have to stop that. It's not sustainable. Now, imagine taking math class in the farmer's field to calculate how much fertilizer do you need and where's it going to come from in order for your crop to be healthy for every living being. Now math class makes sense.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, engineering requires construction, but also assembly. Well, when we have assembly, that's geometry. If we don't have a good basic geometry, not just enough to pass the test, but enough to make the kids in grade 3 build something that's sustainable, like a gazebo in the schoolyard, a greenhouse in the backyard. Well, now the kids really understand geometry and trigonometry before grade 5. Not because they studied it, but because they've had to build something and it fell over 1,000 times.
Mm.
And nobody fixed it for them. That's Indigenous way of knowing. Because this time, when you try it again, you know, you've learned from the time it fell over. What are you going to do different that's not going to let it fall over? Do it again. Do it again. The test of life is living, not an exam on a piece of paper with a bunch of questions that have no connection to how you're going to live your life. And who's to say that an engineer is not also a choreographer? Who's to say that a healer is not also a singer or a dancer? But we've separated ballet from regular school. We've taken School of Architecture outside of the kids' cooking class.
Yeah.
So we've separated everything, and now we wonder, well, why can't they understand it? Well, duh. We've removed the connecting pieces, and we've never given them the opportunity to reconnect those. And that's truth that we have to look at in order for our education system to start reflecting an Indigenous way of knowing and being. And a true experience, and very personal. I was at university here in Sudbury at Laurentian way before the problems happened. And I'm walking down the hall and there's a young woman sitting in the hall crying. So I take a chair and I sit next to her. She does her crying, she gets up and leaves. I put the chair back and continue on my way. Months later, she's in another hallway. I happen to be passing by. She's crying again. I take a chair, I sit next to her, and I let her cry. When she's done, she gets up and leaves. Again, I put the chair back and continue on my way. Almost a year later, she sees me in the hallway again, and she's like, we have to talk.
Oh.
And she was like, what made you do that? And I said, I can't fix whatever got you crying because I don't know what it was. You're not my kid. You're an adult at university. But you don't have to cry alone. After that, she invited me to her culture camp where I met her parents and one of her aunties. She comes up in conversation. I want to do this, whatever this is. Her auntie says, okay, what do you need from me? Not, are you sure? Or a doubting, or we can't do that, we can't afford this, or no. It was, sure, what do you need from me? An automatic yes, without a usurpation of who's in control of this project. And I sat there going, whoa, this is lady power. This is amazing, you know? And it worked because auntie and parents are older. They have access to resources. They know connections that the younger generation does not. And rather than hold those back from the child, the young woman, they just opened the door and let her use it. Let her have it, because she came up with the idea. And they left her in the commanding seat, in the controlling of the environment, of the project, of the resources, of the whatever. And it went without a hitch. It was amazing. And it was my first experience with Indigenous way of being. That there's no interference, there's no cutting off, there's no limitation. You can do this after you've, no, that there was none of that. Well, I can't do it right. There was none of that. I was like, wow, that's living in an Indigenous way. Very healthy. And the adults are survivors of residential school.
I can see, like from every time I learn something about the indigenous culture, I can see how spiritual it is, how deep it is, and how it's not just superficial or tries, like to do things. It just tries to reach to beneath the depth of your heart, right?
Well, to a point, because here's the same auntie. Here's her story from childhood into adulthood. Now, as a little girl, right, she goes to grandma's house and grandma has, she's going to cook a bird. So grandma takes the bird and she prepares the bird in this particular way to put it in the pan, to put it in the oven, to have it cooked. And so she grows up, her mother, right, at home is cooking the bird the same way that grandma is. So the girl is watching grandma and then watching mom. Then she becomes a young woman herself and she asks grandma, why do you do the bird this way? Thinking of this very deep spiritual connection of ancestrally prepared whatever, right? Grandma answers with, well, it's the only pan I had. So it's like, it's really practical. So sometimes it is spiritual and deep philosophical stuff, but other times it's just practical. we we have to be careful about making everything romantic.
Yeah.
The ancients used to do it this way, so we have to no. Adapt or die
This
has been.
specific story, I've heard it as a part of a very, powerful story. I didn't know that it happened actually to someone, like I heard it as a story that, the mother was, like fighting so hard, like you have to cut the fish this way, you have to cut the
Mhm,
food this way, and
mhm,
no other ways. And then, no, I just didn't have another one.
yeah,
And this exactly, like makes you think, like you have to question everything and to find the reasoning behind it.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And you have to find your own reason for it. Do you have the same pot that grandma had, or do you have another pot? Right? And back in the day, if you're living in a wigwam or a teepee or whatever, you do not have a separate kitchen. So you have one container in which to cook everything. So when people tell me that the stew and ragu come from Europe, I laugh. Like, you've no idea, because they did not have a frying pan for their bacon and eggs and a pot for their spaghetti sauce. They had a container in which to cook the fish and the chicken and the caribou and the bear and the whatever else they caught to feed whoever, with the tubers and the fruits and the veg and the seeds and the nuts and the whatever, the herbs, all went together and got prepared with what they had. Well, if that is not a stew, then you know
That's
and
right.
we have finally, they have found physical evidence, footprints now in stone that obviously was sand before, that go back to 20,000, 23,000 years ago. The last ice age was about 12,000 years ago. So when we say, oh, they came over this way or they came over at this, no. We have no evidence of when they were first here.
Mm.
And some people, like the Arctic people, the Inuit, right, circumpolar, They have their own way of preparing food, catching on land and on ice and in water, that has worked for them for millennia. And in the 1950s, the Ottawa government made them move into houses, limited them on reserves. Now we have permafrost problems. We have housing crisis because we're not allowing the Indigenous people, the Inuit, to live in a way they knew was sustainable for their environment. Corporate influence and urban development has changed the climate for everybody. Who's feeling it first? Islanders and Arctic dwellers. And it's a little bit facetious, tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. But if I had my druthers, if I had $1 million, this is what I would do. You want to be a politician? Okay, you have to live 5 years where there is no drinking water, there is no arable land, and you have to thrive in that environment.
You have to
5 years
survive. Yeah.
before you can sit in office.
Exactly.
And that way the expense account and the pay increases to federal employees or elected officials would go back to fixing those places, because that's where citizens live. That's where Indigenous people have been put, not where they come from. That's where the treaty was signed. And there are photos of people who signed at the treaties where the Indigenous men were standing there in tears, signing against their will. So when we talk about treaty, we're all treaty people here. My ancestors were not in Ontario at the time, and there is no signed treaty for my ancestral territory. But my ancestors had treaty with their neighbors to share water, to share hunting resources, trap lines, to share fishing, to share berries, berry territories, right? We'll do it this year, you'll do it the next year, we'll leave it alone for 2 years. That had to be negotiated. So negotiation, consensus, takes time. Yeah, be patient. This idea that your course begins in September and you have to graduate by June, get over it. That is only about 400 years old. The Indigenous way of knowing, whether we're talking about Australia, New Zealand, Africa, or even the Middle East, when we look at the way they traditionally learned, you start in infancy and you're done the day after you've died. There's no need to graduate, certificate, there's no postgraduate, post-fellowship, and no. It's a contribution to the community, to the well-being of all. So we have to start looking at, why are we imposing Western European certificate process on people who've been doing this for millennia?
Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and check out all of our social media platforms. For more information, check out our website.